Welcome to Cave to the Cross Apologetics. I'm Tony.
I'm Patrick.
And we are working our way through John Frame's book, Apologetics. It used to be called Apologetics to the Glory of God. The updated edition now is Apologetics, a justification of Christian belief. And we last time ended by seeing how he works his way through the tag argument, the transcendental argument for the existence of God. And basically the idea here is that there are certain things that need to be assumed if we're going to have knowledge of anything, right? So if we're going to have knowledge of logic, or if we're going to have knowledge of ethics, or how, the uniformity of nature, that they are based on assumptions, says the tag argument, that God exists, right? So reason exists because it's part of the nature of God and ethics and that sort of thing. And so he's been working us through those particular issues, how the tag argument works.
Right.
Now what he does is he raises questions about the tag argument, the transcendental argument for God. And so what we'll see here now is a series of questions, or we might say issues or even problems that he has with the tag argument. So he's kind of given us the argument to make sure that we clearly understand it. And now he's going to say, okay, but here's some questions that we want to consider as we look at this particular argument.
Right.
So let's kind of work our way through these and see what he has to say. So notice he says first that he agrees with VanTil that theistic argument should have a transcendental goal. And so the goal should be transcendental with regard to the theistic arguments. And so he kind of summarizes VanTil's tag here. And so here's his summary of it. This is the way he said it operates, right? Mm-hmm. This isn't an argument, but this is the way it operates. So we presume a biblical epistemology in all of our reasoning. We assume the, epistemology has to do with the nature of knowledge. So we assume the knowledge based on what the Bible has to say. So we assume a biblical epistemology. And then next, we argue that God is the presupposition of all meaning and intelligibility, so that you must presuppose God in order to prove it, right? And he says you respond then to the charge of circularity as he has already done. And then finally, we show that any system that rejects the biblical God loses intelligibility because it's caught up in what he calls the dialectic of rationalism and irrationalism. And so that's kind of the approach that he suggests that the tag argument makes, right? We presuppose biblical epistemology. We argue that God is the presupposition of all meaning, and therefore any system that rejects God is kind of irrational, right? Because it doesn't have a basis or reason for believing these various things that it purports to believe.
Right. That's why you'll always see kind of the two-step approach of presuppositionalism is to point out the flaws of the position of the other side, mostly using their own basis for that critique, but then also providing them the biblical worldview Christian answer. So he moves on from his summarizing a nutshell within a nutshell, as we did last time, of VanTil's 3 points here. He says, you'll notice that VanTil's formulation of tag states a set of conclusions to be reached, but not an argumentative strategy for reaching those conclusions. And I remember Gary Habermas on Eli Allah's Revealed Apologetics talked about how he liked VanTilianism, but he didn't like that VanTil never laid out an argument for his transcendental argument. So here, Frame is in agreement with Habermas. Yeah. And he says that although VanTil calls it an argument, it really is a conclusion rather than an argument. So he says in very Columbo method, I have some questions. Just one more question here.
I got a question here. Right? So he goes through a series of questions. So here's the first one. He says, I question whether tag can function without the help of subsidiary arguments of a more traditional kind. So basically, he's suggesting here that tag may be incomplete, right? Can it function without these various other traditional arguments? He says, although I agree with VanTil's premise that without God, there's no meaning, I must grant that not everyone would immediately agree with that premise, right? So how then is that premise to be proved, right? There's no meaning without God. Okay, how do we prove that? Right, if I say, well, the existence of physical laws presuppose a personal God, that statement cannot be the end of the argument. He says the unbeliever has the right to ask, well, why do you think that that's the case?
Right.
So, what he's getting at here is, yes, he initially agrees with it, but he doesn't think it does everything that VanTil thought it did.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so he cites the great debate between Bahnsen himself and Stein, and he compares, Bahnsen himself compares a theistic view of physical law and logic and morality with as many non-Christian theories as he had time for, and he argues that a Christian view is cogent and the others are not. But that is simply a traditional apologetic argument from causality, similar to Aquinas's kind of first two ways, which is the physical laws exist, therefore God exists. Is that the meaning-laden character of creation requires a sort of designer? But that is the traditional teleological argument. Is that the meaning structure of reality requirements an efficient cause? Well, that's just the traditional cosmological argument. So are we stuck then being classicalists in ultimately in the end? Because it seems like Bahnsen himself, when in the great debate, seems to be using kind of this.
He falls back.
Aquinas.
Yeah, he falls back on these various arguments, right? Even as part of his, tag argument. And so the point that he's making, and this is the main point of point one here, his first question, is it's good, it's helpful, it may not be complete. He says, for instance, on the understanding that you have to kind of fall back. Well, if that's the case, if you have to fall back to an Aquinas type of argument, then VanTil, is doing a transcendental argument, but so is Aquinas, right? If it's true then that VanTil's argument might not be as original then as he thought, if you have to fall back to supplement it with an Aquinas type of argument. He says, now he certainly rejects Aquinas' view of autonomous natural knowledge, but his cosmological argument is a legitimate part of a legitimate tag argument. It supplements the legitimate tag argument when the person asks the next question about tag, right? And so, again, it's not as complete as VanTil thought that the tag argument was, is the point that he's making.
Right. We have a basis to use something like the Kalam argument, the cosmological argument, but it seems like we move then from, God's the first cause, and all things that begin to exist have a first cause. God is that first cause, therefore God exists. That seems to be kind of the cart before the horse, almost, it seems here. So some presuppositionalists have defended the uniqueness of VanTil's argument by pointing out that for VanTil, it is not enough to say that with Aquinas that causality proves God. For VanTil, it is important that even the denial of the causality proves God. So VanTil argued that even atheism presupposes theism, even the denial of God presupposes God. Because again, we're tracing all things back to whether it be rationality, scientific method, ethics. We're saying that only in the biblical Christian God do you find the proper justification for assuming all those things within nature. And so even atheism presupposes God. So the double argument that either the affirmation or the denial of something presupposes God fits in well with some definitions of presupposition in modern analytic philosophy.
Right. Now, he's going to take serious issue with this kind of what he called double argument, right?
Right.
Even the atheist who, denies God is presupposing God. Well, wait, not so fast. He says, then God is not merely the transcendental ground of intelligibility. He is the transcendental ground of intelligibility and non-intelligibility. not and meaningfulness and meaninglessness.
Right.
But he says, if you do that, right, if you do this kind of double argument here, he says this dissolves for him the original meaning and attractiveness of tag. Do we really want to say, he asks us, that even a meaningless, unintelligible world would presuppose God? Well, he's saying, no, I don't think that's what we want to say, right? What would presuppose even meaning in a meaningless world? Well, in fact, nothing, right? Not even God is intelligible, not even to himself in that kind of world. Mm-hmm. And so what's the point here? Well, he says, what kind of God would he be, right? And so he must reluctantly conclude, VanTil tells us, Frame tells us, that at this point, the transcendentalizing of apologetics kind of implodes into nonsense. So you can't have this double kind of, argument where the atheist even presupposes the denial of God presupposes God, because he suggests that kind of moves you off into some type of meaninglessness. And we're trying to make God, the foundation of meaninglessness, and what in the world does that mean? Right. So he takes issue with this kind of double argument.
Mm-hmm. All right. Then he moves on to a second question where he says that he does not agree that the transcendental arguments necessarily conclude with something less than the biblical God. Take the theological argument that the purposefulness of the natural world implies the designer. Well, certainly the God of Scripture is more than a mere designer. But the argument doesn't say that he is merely a designer, only that God is a designer, which he certainly is.
Right. And so the point here is that these traditional arguments, they don't necessarily conclude with something less than the biblical God, right? They're saying that maybe this is where it takes us, but they're not claiming that's the only thing or the only place that it takes us, right? And so if they take us there and they're not claiming that that's the end, then they can be useful arguments. That's what he's trying to get to, right?
Right.
And so, the argument doesn't say that God is merely a designer. Yes, it gets us to a designer, right? Mm-hmm. You need a design of the universe because it has orderliness and purposefulness and that sort of thing. But it doesn't say that that God is only a designer. And sometimes we stop there when he says, that we can go further, because the argument really doesn't say that that's it, right?
Right.
Thirdly, his third issue here with tag and its approach is that he says it should also be remembered that the traditional arguments often persuade people, right? So one of these traditional arguments, right, the teleological argument, the cosmological argument, whatever, they're often persuasive. He says they work. Why? Well, because, whether apologist recognizes it or not, they presuppose a Christian worldview, right? And he says now many people can be led to accept the existence of God through traditional arguments because they agree to a Christian concept of, say, something like causality. Mm-hmm. So he says we must recognize, and this is the point he's trying to make here, the person variability of apologetics, and deal with each inquirer according to their particular lights, right? So what may be persuasive for one person may not be persuasive for another. And so he's suggesting we have to meet people where they are if we're attempting to persuade.
Right.
And sometimes these traditional arguments can do that.
Right. And the Clom argument is nice. It's pretty. It's just got the three premise. You can kind of build out from there. But someone that wants to talk about, children dying in Africa as being a source of evil. Well, the Clom would be the wrong argumentation path to take. We'd want to take something like an ethical system and discuss with that as a classicalist. And so we want to talk about things like evil and free choice and our responsibility to each other, because that's how God designed us and created us, especially the church, to go out into the world and help the poor. So here with tag, just giving the person, well, what are the preconditions of intelligibility, seems to not always be the kind of the one step and only step thing that will get everybody to where we think we want to get to them. It was insightful to me, but everyone is not me, unfortunately, but also fortunately. And so, we have to,
unfortunately for them. But
yeah,
anyway.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a good life. I appreciate it. And so that's his third critique here of tag. All right. And then the fourth one, he says that VanTil's slogan of Christian theism is a unit should be understood with such qualifications. He says, listen, I agree that the slogan is true in the sense that one cannot compromise one doctrine without compromising others. So again, you can't just take out the Gospel of John and just be good with it. All these things work together where God's revelation, especially at this point in the Christian story, go back in on themselves and build each other up and commingle with each other. And so we shouldn't compromise one doctrine without, or we couldn't just take out, God is both fully God and fully man without destroying some other portion of what we're trying to get people to. And in that sense, that accepting one doctrine provides a logical motivation for accepting others. He says, I don't think that the whole of Christian theism can be established by a singular argument unless that argument is highly complex. And tag seems to do the opposite. We're trying to kind of have this single line of argumentation that doesn't have, 82 points to it. If this is the case, then this is the case. If this is also the case, we'd also see this. And if then, and then ultimately conclusion is therefore God exists. So he doesn't see tag as a way of doing this unless if we are wanting to maybe view the Christian theological system as something not complex or basic, as in low level thinking.
And so you need more than just a single argument, right? Again, and he made this a point last time. Tag needs to be supplemented with other arguments. Is what he's getting at. It's not, if one single argument might work, but it will be highly complex, right? Is what he's getting at here. So he says, if we grant VanTil's point that and this is his fifth point here, if we grant VanTil's point that a complete theistic argument should prove the whole biblical doctrine of God, he says, then we must prove more than that God is the author of meaning and rationality. Because, what about the rest of the things that God is, right? Besides proving that God is the author and meaning of, rationality and that kind of stuff, it should include, if we're trying to prove the whole doctrine of God, well, it also should include that God is personal, that he's sovereign, that he's transcendent, that he's immanent, that he's Trinitarian, that he's infinite, that he's eternal and wise and so forth. And obviously tag requires supplementation by other arguments if you're going to go there. And so again, it's not a complete theistic argument is his criticism, right? As VanTil thought it was. It may get us to, God is the author of meaning and rationality, but there's a whole lot more to God than just meaning and rationality.
Right. We're sitting on the bus and we don't want to have to pull out a unfolded pie chart in order to present the gospel message. All right, here's my 82-point plan. Let's go over this. We've got 5 minutes. And you take a deep breath and you start going and build out your argument. All right, and then his final one, his sixth one, he says this. He says, all this suggests a further reason why no single argument will prove the entire biblical doctrine of God. To generalize, any argument can be questioned by someone who is not disposed to accept the conclusion. Such questions might require further arguments to defend the original arguments, and so on and so forth. Since no singular argument is guaranteed to persuade every rational person, no argument is immune from such additional questioning. There's not, the record stretch, the movie's culmination, and the crowd goes silent, and then erupts in big applause as the bad guy's defeated on the debate stage and slinks off, and then comes back with the trophy and hands it to you, and you freeze frame high five at the end. That's not going to happen. It's good in Karate Kid, but not so much in real life. So he says there's no single argument that's immune from additional questioning. Therefore, VanTil's tag, like every other argument, is not sufficient by itself to prove the existence of the biblical God to everyone's satisfaction. And again, he's pointing to the response to people to be convincing, and he says that tag doesn't always seem to be the case to everyone. That this is the one shot that we need, the man with the golden gun approach of GoldenEye here. That sometimes people shake that off, or they're using Oddjob and they're unable to get shot by it right away. So those are kind of the 6 things that he says that tag seems to be deficient on, or that proponents of tag seem to not address as much.
Good. Yeah. And so we can kind of end this here. So we've looked at last time, his presentation of tag. And then this time we've looked at kind of his critique or questions, he calls them, with regard to tag. Right. And so, we can pick it up next time. He wants to move a little further with this whole idea of the transcendental argument and apologetic proof.
Right. Things like God is Trinity, positive and negative points, absolute certainty and probability. All those things are still within the tag category that he's going to bring out here. So again, you probably see the reason why we're splitting this up into multiple episodes. Also, it gives us time to figure it out ourselves and then present them to you. So we appreciate you following us along and continuing to watch the short clips or sharing around. The share, like, subscribe thing is still a thing that we do. Leaving reviews, I guess, if you want to. I like reviewing things. I'll soon have a review out from my 7-year-old on The Hobbit. And so you can check that out at cavetothecross.com as well to see other things that we're talking about within the confines of the biblical Christian worldview. So we thank you for joining us and being part of our book club, where we're opening up the wounds of tag, that it's okay to critique even our golden calves within Christianity. Maybe not so much golden calf, but the picture on the wall.
That's right.
So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.